Thank you so much for having me. I worked here for 8 years, and so it's always fun to come back 3 years later as a speaker. And I see many familiar faces, so thank you. I'm now working at the program on extremism at George Washington University, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about women. There's a lot out there, a lot of misinformation about women, jihadi brides, and a lot of that comes from a lack of applying agency to women's actions. And in order to kind of contextualize this, I'm going to talk a bit about how the organization conceptualizes women's roles, how they were actually utilized in the organization, how they were utilized in life, and then that will kind of build on what future threat does women play. So if we're talking about foreign fighters, David Mallet has one of the most common definitions. We at Program on Extremism go a bit broad. We basically say any person who's traveled to Syria and Iraq since 2011 to participate in a jihadi formation. And the reason we go broad is we don't talk about motivations, and we apply it to all genders. So people who did not fight are included in these numbers as well. Some of, as Brian mentioned, the statistics on who has gone over has been so varied and broad. But some of the best research has been done by the ICSR at King's College London, by Dr. Joanna Cook and Gina Vale. And they estimate the numbers around 41,000 have gone over, 75% of which are men, only 13% women. And of the returnees, the numbers last estimate were 7,366, majority at almost 79% men. At the Program on Extremism, we have created a database. While the FBI estimates that the numbers of attempted and travelers reaches about 300, we've been able to identify 79 individuals by name who have knowingly traveled over. That's by legal name, all of the information we have on them. Of those, 15 are women. That means 81% are men. They've come from 20 different states and are the average age of 27. And 75% of them have joined the Islamic State. So that leaves another 25% that have joined different jihadist formations within Syria and Iraq. Of those, we only know of 17 who have returned. That's 12 men and 5 women. An unnumbered number of children have also come back as well. Those are much harder to track. And we also know that only 13 adults have been charged, 11 men and 2 women. The UK has much higher numbers. We know that approximately 900 individuals have traveled to Syria and Iraq, approximately 150 women. The last estimates that 400 have returned, which is estimated at 40 to 50%. But of those, according to former Security Minister Ben Wallace, only 40 have been prosecuted as of February 2019. That is a very low number. And if you're interested in the jihadis that from the UK, the BBC has a really interesting data set that they've created and have continuously updated. And it's probably one of the best data sets with names regarding individuals from the UK. So how do violent Islamist groups conceptualize women's roles? This is a very brief background, but we know that women, specifically Khadija, Muhammad's first wife, was the first convert to Islam. Women played a very important role in Islam. Aisha, another wife of the Prophet Muhammad, her writings about his life are some of the most cited to this day about his life and all of his teachings. And since kind of the time of the companions of the Prophet, there's been a battle over women's place in history. They are considered the primary educators, but they've also been the center of religious and cultural wars. And I think what I will continue to emphasize throughout this presentation is they've been both victims and perpetrators. Overall, violent Islamist groups conceptualize women's roles in the home as secondary roles, as not the primary outside the home role, but they're not trivializing women. They see that role as extremely important for educating the next generation. Another really important thing when you're talking about how women participate in jihadi formations is understanding the concepts of offensive and defensive jihad. Very, very briefly, because this is a very conceptually in-depth kind of thing, but there is an idea that when Muslim land is under attack, it is the individual duty for all to protect that land. When you are building a state, you are on the offensive. You are trying to gain more land, and therefore there are different requirements for who has to participate in jihad. And if you look at the ideologues that have inspired groups that we see today, Qutb, who believe that Western women were flaunting and were hurting themselves by working outside the home, bin Laden, who believed that women belonged in secondary roles, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who also followed along in the al-Qaeda traditional ideology, they all followed the ideas of offensive and defensive jihad, but they believed the conditions were not yet met for certain things to happen. Abdullah Azzam is where we see the change. So Abdullah Azzam is an extremely interesting gentleman. He believed that the conditions for defensive jihad meant every individual, man, woman, and child, should participate in jihad when those conditions were met. He said that a woman should go and fight without permission of her father or her husband. Zarqawi, of al-Qaeda in Iraq, famed origin, took that to the next step. He said those conditions have now been met, and he began to send female suicide bombers. And we saw that this was the kind of push of taking that ideology and putting it into practice. So why do I think it's important to look at propaganda? Propaganda tells us two things. It tells us how an organization conceptualizes women's roles, and also by tracking propaganda over time, we can see how those roles have changed according to the group. So when do they kind of think those offensive and defensive jihad? When are they playing with those boundaries, and how can those roles change? So if you look at Islamic State propaganda, June 2014, the declaration of the caliphate, there was a shift. There was a shift from the defensive to the offensive. There was a state-building project. And that state-building project took women from the roles that they were playing in al-Qaeda in Iraq, which may have been more operational roles, and put them back into more traditional roles in the home. And the propaganda reflected this. To our sisters in Dabiq 7 talked about being a base of support to your husbands, brothers, and be there for them as they go out and fight the jihad, but be at home. We saw in the Al-Qansam manifesto, women should be wives, mothers, and educators. They could even do some religious practice and even work in the medical field, but they should be at home. In June of 2014, after we saw this kind of, everyone seemed to be shocked by the meteoric rise of the Islamic State, we saw a shift with the coalition against ISIS, and they began to attack the Islamic State. And with that, we began to see a shift, and they began to tease out different ideas of defensive jihad and women's participation. So in Dabiq 11, Dabiq 15, the Zahra Foundation, there started to be the teasing of under what specific conditions could women participate if those conditions were met, which weren't yet the case. And that was kind of the teasing and the ideology. And we also began to see during this period the praising of women who did carry out attacks. So for example, one of the Dabiq, I believe 15, began with a whole praising of Tafshin Malik for the San Bernardino attacks. So despite the fact that they weren't claiming her as their own, they were saying, look at this woman, look at her going out and shaming all of you men into taking action. And what we see here is in Al-Naba in 2016, we see this quote. Jihad is not as a rule an obligation for women, but let the female Muslim know as well that if the enemy enters her abode, jihad is just as necessary for her as it is for the man, and she should repel him by whatever means necessary. In 2017, we began to see the Islamic State drastically losing territory. And what that meant was there's all of a sudden a very big shift. The offensive jihad that we saw taking place was no longer taking place. It began to become a defensive operation. And women were told in our journey to Allah in 2017, rise with courage and sacrifice in this war, as the righteous women did at the time of the messenger of Allah, not because of the small number of men, but rather due to their love of jihad, for their desire for sacrifice for the sake of Allah and their desire for Jannah, heaven. Among those blessed women were Mara. Now, without getting too in-depth into kind of jihadi propaganda, Mara is a red flag for people. So when you call to the time of Mara, it's basically a signal to kind of for women to take up arms. It was used as a call during the time of al-Qaeda in Iraq, and it's been used by other groups as well. So by putting into their propaganda and calling to and think about and talk about Mara, they're basically calling for their women to pick up arms. And we see that reiterated in the obligation of women to engage in jihad in 2017 as well. And this image over here is actually fascinating. So if you study propaganda of the Islamic State, there's no images of women. In my tracking of all Islamic State propaganda, there was 3 images of young girls, but never an image of women. And so for the first time in Inside the Caliphate 7, there was the first time we saw what we are to believe is a woman, because again, I cannot tell. He or she is in full dress, but there is someone in a full niqab, who was shooting a gun. And they're talking, the overlay of the video was talking about women picking up arms and joining in the fight. So we see this huge shift of women being in the home to joining the fight. According to propaganda, women's roles should be to come and join the state, be part of the state building, to do hijra, to be wives, supporters, to be part of a sisterhood, to be part of a safe place. The West isn't safe for women. Come and join this safe place. To be part of a new jihadi feminism and be jihadi torchbearers for the next generation. So to go out and sell that ideology to future generations. But as we all know, propaganda is not practice. The realities were women weren't allowed outside the house, many times without a male escort. So we were talking about returnees. So a lot of the early returnees were men because they were able to escape. A lot of women had a hard time escaping, even if they had become disillusioned, because they physically were not allowed to travel without a male escort, which means they had to find a man who they trusted to help smuggle them out. We know that they were subjugated to men. We know that there was sex slavery and polygamy rampant. We know that they were wives and mothers and educators, but not always willingly. Sometimes there was very many disagreements between husbands and wives about how to educate the children in the home. We know that they were both victims and perpetrators. And we know that only in defensive jihadi situations were they actually picking up arms. So the caliphate has fallen. The physical caliphate has fallen, I should say. What now? Al-Hol camp in Syria has become a bit of a female caliphate. We have approximately 70,000 individuals in this camp, 30% women, 60% children, at least 7,000 under the age of 12. According to the UN, there's 80% are Syrian and Iraqis and 15% are foreigners. Controlled by the SDF, this is a non-state actor. They can't actually do anything other than monitor the camp. The conditions are dire, there's lack of medical care, and people are segregated by nationality. And what's really interesting here is that because they're segregated by nationality, there's a huge difference in how they are treated. So many of the Syrian and Iraqi women have access to cell phones and through the Hawala network, without getting too much into financing, have access to money. The foreign women don't, and so therefore they're reliant either on friends within the Syrian side of the camp to pass them phones or give them money, and so therefore the conditions within the foreigner part of the camp are much more dire than the others. According to a friend of mine who was recently at the camp, the SDF has not entered the foreign fighter side of the camp in over 10 weeks. Last time they went in, they got an individual got stabbed, and so they're kind of just not monitoring it. They're too scared to go in. Women are policing other women. So I think what's really interesting is we talked about people who tried to leave in the first wave versus later wave. So people who left in fled in December, may have left willingly. They may have been trying to flee, whereas those that stayed until the last stand in Baghouz were much more ardent supporters. We also know that women picked up arms in the last stand in Baghouz. There's videos of women shooting and being part of the last fight. So we know that they are more hardcore supporters, and so there's definitely a fight happening between these two groups. So we were speaking about Iraq. So Iraq has 4-minute trials for women. Their crimes are tied to the men they traveled with, and there is what we call a one-size-fits-all prosecution. That means best case scenario, you get a life in prison. Worst case scenario, you are sentenced to death. We were talking about who was they've sentenced people, but we do know that they have killed a number of women, but mostly from Asia and Africa, and they have not yet started to execute Western women because I believe it will lead to an international crisis that they're not ready to face yet. In Syria, there's an uncertain fate. They're being held by the SDF, who's a non-state actor. And so there's questions about what do we do with them? And so they're kind of just sitting there until we figure out what happens with this legal limbo. My colleagues really talked on this a bit already, but in the UK and the US, there's a political backlash. There's issues of limited evidence. What isn't been talked about is sentencing bias, men versus women. A colleague of mine, Audrey Alexander and Rebecca Turlington, did some really interesting research on men versus women. So we know that in general sentencing, there's already a gender bias, that men are, there's sentencing guidelines in the US, which kind of give you a minimum and a maximum you can sentence somebody for. And they're kind of supposed to get you around the sentencing bias. But we still know in regular crimes, there is a sentencing bias. For terrorism charges, men get on average 13 years, women on average 5 years. So there's a huge gap about how long they're being sentenced for, which means they're getting early release, and there's questions about the risk of recidivism. And when you really break down the differences, for example, between the US and the UK, in the United States, there's kind of a bigger catch-all law that we like to apply. So women can be charged with conspiring, attempting to provide, or providing material support for a foreign terrorist organization. The U.S. has emphasized the repatriation of foreign terrorist fighters. And just recently, in June of 2019, 2 more women and 6 children were brought back. And of course, there are exemptions to this. So, for example, Hudu Muthana, for those that don't know, was recently denied the fact that she ever had U.S. citizenship because there was questions. It's a bit of a complicated case, but there was questions over was she ever really a U.S. citizen in the first place. And there's a new case, John Doe versus Mattis, of a Saudi American citizen who is currently fighting not to have his U.S. citizenship revoked. The other issue in America is that we don't have a long history of de-radicalization programs. So there's one major program running right now, and it's been running for about 3 years. So that's not a long history to kind of build off of. In the United Kingdom, it only became illegal to travel to what they are calling hotspots, so specifically conflict zones, such as certain parts of Syria and Iraq, only in June of 2019. That means there's an issue of going back and looking at what about people who traveled before? What can you charge them under? And there's a huge question, as we saw with the numbers. 400 have returned and only 40 have been prosecuted to date. So there's a huge kind of gap that needs to be addressed in the UK. They're also extremely reluctant to repatriate foreign fighters because they don't necessarily have the laws in place. They have begun to strip citizenship, so we know that Shamima Begum has been stripped of her citizenship, as have Jack Letts. So it doesn't seem to be gender biased at the moment. They just seem to, in cases where they feel they can, strip citizenship. They do have a number of de-radicalization programs. So the UK is an advantage here is that they've been running programs like Prevent that have been focusing on how to kind of counter radicalization for a long time. And one would hope that they really try to use the knowledge from these programs. But again, it depends on if they're actually going to repatriate individuals. And as Brian mentioned, the new EU registry. The most interesting and fascinating part for me about this is that the UK might not be able to participate due to Brexit. So it's really interesting to talk about theoreticals, and I just want to do one quick case study before I finish. Sam Al-Hassani. So when Sam came back, there was an interesting article in Elle magazine of all places, and they called her the American woman forced to join ISIS. And if this isn't a gender-biased headline, I'm not sure what is. Also, the fact that it's an Elle magazine. In the case US v. Al-Hassani, we see that she's been charged with conspiring to provide material support for ISIS and aiding and abetting individuals who've providing material support for ISIS. And what's really interesting about this case is the U.S. government says she may have regrets and she may have done good and tried to protect people while under the Islamic State, but in the process leading up to it, she willingly went. She did multiple trips to get money and arms for her husband and her brother-in-law, who also joined the Islamic State with her, and that she took an active role and had agency while choosing to join the Islamic State. Once there, she obviously became disillusioned. Her husband bought 2 female sex slaves, as well as a young Yazidi boy who became part of her home. All 3 individuals are part of her testimony for the fact that she has repented. And so it's a very interesting case about what happens when people become disillusioned. And this is not necessarily about gender. And we know that some people went to the Islamic State and aren't believers, and some of them are extremely disillusioned. Overall, I'd argue that gender roles are central to violent Islamist groups. And while they prefer women to be in the private sphere, they're willing to utilize women in different roles. We need to understand how groups conceptualize women, and we need to know that women and men can be both victims and perpetrators. Some are still full believers, and some are disillusioned. The threat perception of women has also changed. In 2016 and 2017, we saw 2 all-female cells where women were taking up arms without men, and we're seeing kind of what I said before was the female caliphate, where the men aren't there, and yet they're still believing in the cause. And so there are ideas of what belief is or what a woman's role is has started to change, and we need to address that when we're talking about bringing women back. And we need a solution because the status quo is not working.